So today I'm here to tell you about some of the work that we did last year and to give you an idea of some things that we don't necessarily have time for. They're a little bit peripheral to our mission, but we could certainly use the help of some enthusiastic botanists. And a lot of the issues that I'll be talking about will be related to garden plants that are escaping to the wild, things that haven't been documented yet as wild plants in Nova Scotia, but probably are. And they're often quite pretty and spectacular, things like these species you see on the screen now. So moving along, we'll start off with some highlights from our 2025 vascular plant fieldwork in Nova Scotia. These are the different projects that we were involved with in Nova Scotia. We had contracts with COSEWIC, that's the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, a federal committee under Environment and Climate Change Canada, but an arm's length committee. And they produce the reports and make the recommendations to government about which species should be protected under the Species at Risk Act. These two species you probably know really well. You've seen them in other presentations and in person on different trips. They're kind of the flagship species of the Atlantic coastal plain flora, the special southern plants of southern Nova Scotia. And these were update status reports. So every 10 years, the federal government is obligated to look again at each species that's already listed and see how they're doing. So that's what we were contracted to do. Then we had some projects with Nature Conservancy of Canada. I'll tell you about both Chignecto Isthmus Priority Place project in the River Phillip estuary and some specific site inventories in southern Cape Breton. And these were done all with my colleagues, Ian Grohl, who's a full-time botanist with us, and botany intern, a summer student, but incredibly talented young botanist, just finished his second year of university, Tristan Hallett. We'll start off with the COSEWIC status reports. This is the very attractive Plymouth gentian, one of the biggest clumps of flowers of that species that I had seen. Biggest, densest clumps. So I got some pictures of it. You remember that it was very dry last summer and we were banned from the woods, but the provincial government, to my surprise and pleasure, was very efficient in allowing permits for us to go in. I just filled out their form and in under 24 hours, I had a permit for us to conduct our work, which I was quite worried about. So we certainly were not presenting any fire risk there along the lake shores. As we canoed and walked and waded in the water. It was a really good year for the plants because the shorelines were so wide and the temperatures were high. These are southern plants that like the heat generally, as long as they've got water. And so we were comparing results from, we did the status reports 10 years ago as well. So we were pretty well placed to spot differences in status. And numbers were higher, which doesn't tell us a lot. The conditions are different year to year in these plants. As you saw when they were flooded, you don't see many flowers at all. And they're just hard to even count. When the shores are really wide, you see a lot more of them. But to what extent that's actual population fluctuation, because these are perennials, it's a bit unclear. But we can at least say they're not overall going down by the looks of it. Numbers were very high, the highest that have ever been recorded for Plymouth gentian. Generally where they were in the past, they're at present. Lake Fanning is a bit of a different situation. That's a lake that's on the river system, the Carleton River system, that had a lot of mink farming 10 years ago. The mink farms have mostly gone. There's still a few that are operating. Economic effects wipe them out. But they still have big manure pools that are leaching into the river slowly or quickly if they fail. And all the nutrients from that mink effluent does stay in the system for a prolonged period. It's not something that flushes out rapidly, phosphorus. So these shoreline plants like nutrient poor conditions. They don't like a lot of rich nitrogen and phosphorus. And on Lake Fanning, it seems that they're maybe getting out competed by both native plants and locally some even reed canary grass, introduced reed canary grass, which you don't see ever on any of the more acidic, natural, unaltered coastal plain lakes. So one lake, very small portion of the population, they're not doing so well. On Annis Lake, which is also a different branch of the Tuscan system from any other population, there were quite a lot more, and they seem to have maybe spread. There was a landowner who said his father actually introduced them, took them from Wilson's Lake and planted them at Annis Lake, and they've been spreading ever since. It seems like it's maybe like a 40-year expansion of the plants at that lake, slow and steady colonization of this lake, maybe after a human introduction. They're treated as a native population, but they may actually not be. Pink coreopsis was the other species we were looking at. High numbers as well, generally stable distribution and doing fine by the looks of things, except at Pleasant Lake, which is a little lake that's very different from the others. It's right up against the head of the tides, and it's quite salty. It has Liliopsis, which I'll talk about later, which is more of a estuarine plant. And my guess is that there's more salt water in that lake than there was historically, and we couldn't find a single plant of pink coreopsis there. So it may be extirpated. Certainly was a tiny population to begin with. Raynard's Lake numbers were down from the highs that had been recorded. Raynard's Lake is a hydro reservoir, so it's dammed. It holds water to be sent down to the big dam at Tuscan Falls. But the plants were counted, I think it was 2014 by Alan Beliveau, in a year when the dam was being repaired. So the water had gone way out of the reservoir, and there were a lot more plants there than we were able to find this year. So that's another human impact on this species. And likewise at Annis Lake, numbers seem to have increased and distribution seems to have increased. Possibly this is the long-term expansion. That was the Kosiwik work. The other big project one of the other big projects was this Chignecto Isthmus Community Nominated Priority Place. The Priority Place program was something that Environment and Climate Change Canada put together to help fund proposals in regions that were especially important for species at risk. And community nominated means that groups could say, we think this particular area is should be one of these priority places. Nature Conservancy of Canada nominated the Chignecto Isthmus, both sides, the Nova Scotia side and the New Brunswick side, so from Moncton over to Oxford, more or less. And as part of that, Nature Conservancy of Canada was interested in finding out more about the River Phillip. It's quite an interesting river. It's known for having rich floodplain forest flora further upstream from Oxford. And it's the best river in Nova Scotia for freshwater tidal habitats, or very slightly brackish tidal habitats. And that's what we were mostly focused on. This is a fully tidal stretch that you're looking at here. So this is downstream from Oxford towards the Northumberland Strait. And some of the examples of the special plants that occur in this zone, that it gets daily tides, but it doesn't get a lot of salt. Basically, the incoming tide creates sort of a dam that backs the fresh water up. And the salt doesn't intrude that far inland, but the tides can go quite a long way up because it's quite flat land. So the most special of these plants is the Eastern Liliopsis. This is a coastal plain plant that is otherwise in Nova Scotia only known from from Bridgewater and southward to Bridgewater to Tuscan. So this is quite a disjunct occurrence, the most northern one in the whole world, and it's really, really abundant there. It's for 10 solid kilometers. It's hugely abundant. My guess is that the next time that one is reviewed for assessment, it will go to not at risk. There's just so much of it on these rivers, and then it's not a highly threatened habitat with. There's not so much people can do in the tidal mud, unfortunately. Another special plant that is moderately common in the River Phillip and almost nowhere else. There's a few places in the New Glasgow estuaries. It's called estuarine beggar's ticks. It's a distinctive little beggar's ticks. There's other species of beggar's ticks that look quite similar, but it's It's got little flowers with fairly long rays for a beggar's stick. Some of them don't have those yellow rays at all, but not very many of them. And you can see that picture shows how the tide comes right up in on these plants at high tide. A few more of the special tidal plants. Southern mudwort, that's a plant that's in the sort of related to snapdragons. It's a kind of tiny little grass-like plant, grows on the mud. And small-flowered brookweed, or water pimpernel is another name for it. There's tons and tons of that on the River Philip as well. And Ian found this interesting bulrush species. We're not really quite sure what it is, but it maybe is most similar to this thing called Bulboscinus novianglii, the New England New England bulrush, which is itself derived as a hybrid of a freshwater species and a saltwater species. We need some more work to figure out exactly what it is. Just this week, Ian was trying to do some more work. He was slicing the seeds, the achenes, open to see the structure of the arrangement of the layers of cells, to see if he could tell. He's still not sure. So that was the River Philip. Nature Conservancy will continue to do work in that area and hopefully develop a sort of a system of connected or interrelated protected areas along there. Another important focal area for NCC is southern Cape Breton in the gypsum country around the Bredor Lake. These are two properties, the Campbell's Cove and the Ottawa Brook property that we visited in June. 1 day each to do a full species inventory, birds and plants. This is the Campbell's Cove property. It's a little sub-inlet of a sub-inlet, and we're right at the head of it there. So that's a tidal cove. And then at the very top of it, it's pretty much freshwater marsh habitat, but it's quite rich and basic soils with some really interesting plants. That's the uppermost arrow there. That's where the most interesting part of this property was. We had some sort of interesting tidal shoreline, and that old gravel pit, old sand pit in the bottom corner also had some interesting flora. That's quite a rare sedge, not super spectacular looking, called the long-stalked yellow sedge, close relative of what we call the greenish sedge, Carex viridula. This is a species that is in Europe, but in North America, it only occurs in sort of in the Maritimes, really. And to me, it seems very distinct as a species. I think we should, in Europe, they call it Carex lepidocarpa, and that's probably, in my estimation, a better distinction for it, rather than a variety of this other thing that doesn't really look like or act like much at all. The distinctive thing about it is this really long section between the female flowers and the male flowers at the top. So these are fen species. The Labrador bedstraw is another fen-specific, calcareous fen-specific species. And the Lozel's fen orchid, she didn't find it in the fen, we found that in the gravel pit. It's more of a gravel pit specialist in Nova Scotia, that one. Moist sand pits that have a little bit of calcareous water flowing through them. That's where you find that plant. Onto the Ottawa Brook property. This one is a little bigger. The Campbell's Cove was quite small. This one's over 1 kilometer long, not very wide, but it has a lot of diversity in it. At the south end, the bottom of the map picture, and I should mention those are our GPS tracks that are swirling all around inside there. The bottom end has that gypsum karst topography where the landscape is just all broken up because of the bedrock eroding and collapsing and caves forming underneath. It's really rugged and hard to get around in those areas, but you have a few special plants on there. And some of the other areas where it's not so fully eroded, but there's bigger holes eroded into the gypsum, you get the sinkhole ponds. And that's what you see in the other pictures. The gypsum karst had some of this ebony sedge. That's kind of a specialist of gypsum in Nova Scotia. It's a tiny sedge with, or the leaves are very, very fine, like hair-like leaves. And the fruit, the perigynia, are black. It's the only sedge that develops black perigynia. That's why it's called ebony sedge. Some of the fen habitats around the sinkholes had showy lady slipper, beautiful plant that is kind of typically, fairly typically found in southern Cape Breton in the right places, but still rare in the province. Another one that's a specialist of the gypsum areas for Nova Scotia is this Philadelphia fleabane. It's a little bit prettier than the other fleabanes that we have, brighter pink color. The leaves that you can see there, they clasp right around the stem. They don't have any teeth on the edges typically as you go up the stem. That tells you it's Philadelphia fleabane. It also flowers earlier than our rough fleabane and daisy fleabane that are the more common, more weedy, dry ground ones. But right around that southern gypsum Bredor Lakes area, you find a fair bit of this Philadelphia fleabane. It can be quite weedy on the back roads. But the most special part of this Ottawa Brook property was this fen. It barely showed up on the aerial photos, but boy, it was a special, special place. So there's a ton of groundwater seeping through here, bringing nutrients to the surface and keeping the ground from closing into forest. And despite its small size, it had some exceptionally good plants in it. These ones, they're all fairly obscure looking plants, but they're all really good finds for Nova Scotia. The 5-flowered spike rush, most of our spike rushes, which are a type of sedge, they all have that little elongated ball inflorescence on the tip of the stem. Most of them have a lot more flowers than just 5. You can sort of see that the little bits they're sticking out there, flowers. Small-headed rush. This one was on our Nova Scotia list of plants, but as I investigated further after finding this case, I think the 2 records that we have already are, well, one is in southern Nova Scotia and is probably wrong because it's in a more acidic habitat where this species just wouldn't occur. And the other one is reported from Cape Breton, but there's no real details, no specimen. So this one, I'm calling it the first definite record for Nova Scotia. And that's a nice thing to have found. Specialist of calcareous habitat. For those who are online, if you wouldn't mind muting, that might help. And we're getting some sound in the background. Wendy McDonald, maybe. And then there's this little beak rush, another different kind of sedge, different genus of sedges called the Rhynchospora, the beak rushes. This is only known from 3 places in Nova Scotia, 2 others, and this new one that we just found. And it's quite a rare plant in the whole of eastern, from Quebec eastward. It's rare everywhere. So some good fens up at the Ottawa Brook site. So coming back from Ottawa Brook, Tristan and I were just watching roadside weeds. This is just outside of Truro, and I saw this patch of iris, which right away I knew was not our regular blue flag iris. It's got a much deeper blue-purple color, and it just has a bit of a distinctive look to it. So I slammed on the brakes and got out, and it's Japanese iris. I don't know how it got on the roadside here, but I don't think it was planted, at least not this extensively, over 10, 15 meters or so. Probably been there for, who knows, 20 years or more. Maybe it was part of some roadside memorial or something, but now it's pretty much a fully wild plant. It hadn't been recorded in the wild in Nova Scotia before. We stopped, we got some specimens, we took these photos, and I'm listing it as a wild Nova Scotia species now. So we're transitioning into the other half of the talk, the garden plants to the wild sort of part of the talk. Scientific name of Japanese iris is Iris sanguinea. That means blood because of those blood red sheaths or spathes underneath the flowers. Very pretty. You can see why people like this as a garden plant. There's probably, and I've seen it escaping to the wild in a number of places. It does really quite well when people dig up the rhizomes and just throw them off into a ditch or something, and it'll sprout from those. And it happened that we got another new plant for Nova Scotia as we were looking at this iris, this special cinquefoil called AC cinquefoil. It's a European species, and it is a hybrid-derived species, a stabilized hybrid of the two species that you might know. They're quite common European introduced cinquefoils, the sulfur cinquefoil and the silvery cinquefoil. I'll show you those in the next slide. But the stabilized hybrid concept is basically, it's functioning now as its own species. It's reproductive and it doesn't require the parents to keep going, but it originated as a hybrid, potentially hundreds or thousands of years ago. So that was the ashy cinquefoil. And here's a look at the two parent species. The sulfur cinquefoil is quite a tall species, 1.5 feet tall, and it doesn't have silvery undersides to the leaves. You can see the toothing on the leaves is quite different between the silvery and the sulfur cinquefoil, and the ashy cinquefoil is quite nicely intermediate between the two, with fairly big teeth and not so many, but not as big as these ones and not as few as these ones, and sort of white underneath, but not strongly white underneath. And it's easily mistaken for this other hybrid-derived European cinquefoil, the intermediate cinquefoil, which is more prevalent. That's a hybrid of the silvery cinquefoil and the Norway cinquefoil. Just make a quick comparison there. That's the key from Go Botany that tells us why this is definitely the inclinata, the ashy cinquefoil. Gray-green underneath, and the petals are a bit bigger, and the epicalyx, which is these bits up here, this is the true calyx, and this is the epicalyx. They're more long and narrow, lanceolate. All right, here's another discovery that's not by us that was quite an interesting one that I wanted to talk about. It was by this fellow named Rostislav Yurechko, who's a Ukrainian immigrant. I got in touch with him once I noticed this record. He has since moved from Halifax to Victoria, BC. But he was out at Rainbow Haven Beach Provincial Park, and he took a picture of this plant. I don't know if he knew what it was at the time, but he was familiar with this milk parsley species from Ukraine. For some reason, he recorded it only by video initially, and he posted the video to YouTube. And then, so this is a still from, it's a picture of his phone showing the video. Anyway, he made this identification of this species that had never been seen in Canada before, a European species, and it's quite uncommonly reported anywhere in North America. The only other place it's established really is around Boston and maybe just into Connecticut. Here's some pictures from the internet of what it looks like. It's a big plant that looks like a wild carrot, kind of similar to a lot of other things like that, with highly divided leaves and a big umbel of white flowers. And this is where we start getting into the we could use your help part. And why do we need your help? Well, when we have these records from iNaturalist, some of them you can correspond with the person and get some details, and you can accept that the record is fully wild and it's reasonable to include as a wild species in Nova Scotia. But others, you can't get in touch with the person, or you can't make the you're not 100% certain on the identification from the photo, or you're certainly not sure if it's wild or cultivated. That is a big problem with iNaturalist. People love taking pictures of their garden plants. And if it's not noted as being a garden plant, it's hard to know what it means scientifically. It's also important to document plants, new plants, with a specimen that can be pressed and put into a museum and there for the permanent record. So there are all these records that are being discovered on iNaturalist, but we can't run around and find them all. We just don't have the staff and the time. So that's where we could use your help. And we'll go back to milk parsley. It seems like there's another record of milk parsley that showed up more or less in Halifax, up in Sackville, by Sybil Nunn. Maybe some of you know Sybil Nunn, I don't know. She's a very keen eye naturalist person, and she took a picture of this plant up at the intersection of 102 and 101. And probably eye naturalist automatically identified it as milk parsley. And I think it's correct, but it's not a species I know very well. And it would be nice to see the seeds and the flowers to tell for sure. So if someone could go up there and find it, it's right on that trail, the Bedford-Sackville Connector Greenway, at more or less at that busiest highway intersection in Nova Scotia. And it looks like it's quite a precisely located record. It's probably the phone probably recorded exactly where that plant was. It'd probably be quite easy to go back and find it. So I wanted to make that point. If you are keen to record on iNaturalist, and if you are taking pictures of garden plants, there's a way that you can help us out, us being the botanists who are trying to use the iNaturalist information. Click that captive cultivated box to tell us that it is not a wild record, or make a note in the notes field there that says from my garden or planted deliberately or something of that sort. That helps. So this is not our main focus as an organization. Our main focus is understanding the native biodiversity, but we do want to maintain a comprehensive list, and we do want to keep track of what's coming into our flora. The things that are escaping from gardens today can become invasives later on. A lot of our most invasive species started out as garden plants. These are some examples that you're probably pretty familiar with. Tartarian honeysuckle, going clockwise, over to black swallowwort or dog strangling vine, down to the oriental bittersweet, garlic mustard, glossy buckthorn. They're all horticultural plants originally, but escaped and causing problems in Eastern North America. It's also just a fun thing to do. Most of us are interested in the diversity of forms that are out there with plants, just the beauty and diversity, and the exotics are just as beautiful and diverse and interesting visually as the natives, if you let them be, I guess, in your own mind. All the pictures that will be associated with these next slides are ones that are on my list of things that are maybe escaped, maybe not, that we'd like some more information on. And most of the records, unsurprisingly, are Halifax area records, just because there's so many people and so many gardeners in Halifax. So both of these plants, I have some sites to check out in Halifax that I can share with you if you're interested. So if anyone's interested in helping out, trying to track down some of these plants, just get in touch with me right now at the end. I can write your name down, send an email. That's probably really easiest. We've got a list of iNaturalist records with coordinates and with an estimate of the uncertainty of those coordinates, saying we think it's within 10 meters or we think it's within a few hundred meters. You just have to put those coordinates into your phone and follow the phone right to the place where this plant was seen. And then record some notes and take some pictures and record notes with a tag in the notes field so that we'll get to see it. Those are our iNaturalist usernames there. And it'd be nice to get rid of those those streaks that I've somehow written on the screen, but I'll leave them. What data to record? Good photos of all the diagnostic features and a detailed description of the occurrence. What habitat is it in? And details that are relevant to, is it wild or not? Is it truly a member of the self-perpetuating member of our flora. These are some of the characters that I'd like detail on. And is the habitat an anthropogenic, a human-made habitat, or more of a natural habitat, or something in between? Is it still actively managed if it's an old field, or is it a crop field, or is it an old field? The location, is this far away from any house, or is it right beside a house site or a building or something of that sort? Do you have an idea of how it got there? Is it likely that someone deliberately planted or seeded it, or is it most likely naturally spread? Is there evidence of reproduction on the site? Reproduction by seed is especially interesting, and especially if you're seeing plants that probably originated from seed, they're now themselves producing seed. That helps tell us that it is established. Length of establishment. A really big patch, like that patch of wild lily of the valley, of lily of the valley at the top, European lily of the valley, that has obviously been there for a long, long time, probably 100 years or so. That's right in Kejimkujik National Park, actually, where a much smaller patch is probably not nearly as old. Same with the periwinkle that you see below there. That's something that you'll sometimes see very large patches of. It doesn't seem to spread by seed very much, but it can spread vegetatively out and out and out for forever, probably. And then an assessment of is this a long-term thing? You might see a small number of plants in a tiny piece of habitat that's going to be like a vacant lot in Halifax. It's just going to be turned into apartments in 5 years. It's probably not something that I'd want to record as a wild plant in Nova Scotia on that basis. Where if it's on the edge of a big forest and spreading into that big natural forest, that's a different story. So that's the kind of information that helps us decide what to do with all these records. So on to some specific examples of priority things to look at. This is one that we're going to try to look at ourselves. This is actually a native species that was brought up on iNaturalist. I think it's this sedge called Carex annectens, the yellow fruit sedge, but it's very similar to another sedge. Jamie Van Buskirk, another really keen naturalist in Halifax, who's on iNaturalist all the time, found this plant up in sort of Stewiacke area in a cattle pasture. It's never been seen in Nova Scotia before. It's been seen 3 other times, twice in New Brunswick and once in Prince Edward Island. It's a species that likes moist, calcareous meadows. Here's a fine scale comparison with the most similar species. The fox-like sedge is reasonably common in the same sorts of habitats. It looks very similar, but the perigynia, the fruit there in the bottom, left, I guess, are fairly distinctive. Oh, I put the labels on wrong. That's not, yeah, the yellow fruit sedge is the yellow one. Not surprisingly. Sorry about that. Was not very good. So that's one of our really high priority ones. This is another one that might be a new species for Eastern North America. I saw this record on iNaturalist and I thought that doesn't look quite right for Artemisia vulgaris. It's clearly an Artemisia species. And I tried hard to make it into something else that's already listed on the various Eastern North American lists. And it didn't seem to be anything that fit. And I looked on the literature. This is down near Wedgeport in the southernmost part of Nova Scotia. And I found this article by a Dutch botanist that talks about Artemisia princeps, an overlooked invasive Far Eastern weed in Western Europe. And then he had a very detailed article about how this Japanese mugwort differs from the common mugwort, European species that's widespread around here, and some other related species. And so I emailed him. I emailed Philip Verlove, and he wrote back right away and said, I'm actually publishing a paper that says this is in Canada too. It's just been discovered or just been finally confirmed on the West Coast in British Columbia, around Vancouver. So this paper was published April 15th, 2026. Very new academic news right here. And in this case, it seems that almost all the what was being called mugwort out there in British Columbia is actually the Japanese one, not the European one. We don't know much about to what extent that might be similar here, but my guess is that it is actually different here because this particular plant looks different from our regular mugwort, different enough that I noticed it. But I might just be entirely wrong too. It's not enough with this picture to tell. Even Philip Verlove looked at this record and said, I can't tell for sure from this. You'll need a specimen. So this is quite a different slide. Looking at Japanese mugwort, there's lots of interesting information on it because it's an important plant in medicine and in cuisine in Japan and in Korea. So in Japan, it's called yomogi, and in Korea, it's called suk. And there's some different pictures of Japanese and Korean uses. It's ground up as a powder and used as flavoring with rice, various sorts of rice cakes, and they'll do the leaves in tempura. I like the fact that there's this special kind of Japanese mugwort rice cake that's just for the Dolls Festival / Peach Festival on March 3rd. I just enjoyed that. So away from the dessert treats onto some more plants. This plant, I was actually at this site this afternoon trying to track this plant down, yellow fumitory. It's a garden plant that kind of likes rocky spots, but will also grow in more deep soils. And this one was nicely noted as being on a public path next to gardens, likely persistent escapee. So I tracked this down out in Purcell's Cove Road area. And sure enough, it was there. I found the leaves. It's not flowering yet. It's quite an early flowering thing, but it was not that far along. And I made notes, and there were about 15 clumps of it. It was along a public pathway between two big houses that went from one road to a different road. And I looked over into the adjacent yards. I couldn't find it in the adjacent yards. It's undoubtedly spread from someone's garden, but it's not a continuous patch from a garden occurrence out to this pathway. It's established at this spot. It's been there since 2018, so it's doing all right, but it was only present over about 1.5 meters. And do we call this a established plant? It's kind of borderline in this particular case. But looking around at other iNaturalist records, this is showing up in Halifax in a bunch of places. You can see it's growing right out of brick walls down on Armory Place, Maynard Street. And there's a bunch of other records, and there's some scattered other records too. Maybe Bob will find the power supply on that. So collectively, probably with all these different occurrences, it's getting to the point where it's reasonable to call it established. There's another look at it. So this is in Annapolis Royal. Similar situation where it's in a pretty urban area, but it's growing on its own in cracks in a walkway. Sure. So we're coming up to the end of my examples here. This is another one. I did look for this today, and I wanted to point out, if you're interested in following up on some of these green circles in iNaturalist are an important thing to know about. That shows you how uncertain the location is. So the point is plotted down right there, and you click into details on the screen, you get an exact coordinate. But there's I think it was 400 meters uncertainty. So that's sent me out through a whole large neighborhood up there in Blaney. And I was driving around this afternoon. It says on the record, observing wild land beside the community mailbox. I found a bunch of different community mailboxes, and some of them had wildland around them, some of them didn't. I didn't find this plant at all, but it's probably still there. It probably was too early to be found. It's spring cinquefoil, which tells you it's going to be flowering quite early, but maybe it's a bit too early for it right now. So that remains a mystery that someone else can solve in a month's time, especially if you happen to be up in that neighborhood if that's where you live. Lovely area. It's an interesting species because it's not, it's one that's really early in becoming established. This is its entire known North American distribution on iNaturalist. And these are all research grade records, so they're probably correctly identified. And it's just the one record in Nova Scotia. So it's not a really prevalent garden plant, but it is starting to become established, at least in southern Ontario. So I would be interested to hear from anyone who's interested themselves in helping us figure out some of these plant mysteries, these maybe established plants in Nova Scotia. And you certainly aren't limited to just going and looking at plants that have already been pointed out on iNaturalist. It's pretty easy if you're looking in weedy spots to find your own new plants for Nova Scotia, new things that are coming from people's gardens or new weeds that have arrived through human activity some other way. It's a pretty interesting way to botanize without having to go off into overly rugged terrain or far, far away from home. But do remember, if you're using iNaturalist, and I know not everyone does use iNaturalist, but for those who do, that wild versus non-wild is a really useful thing for the end user to have. And we're also obviously even more interested in rare native species records. If you happen to have any of those, or if you're interested in surveying for rare native species, get in touch with us and we might be able to come up with some other little project ideas that you could help with. This was one thing I failed to remember in choosing this computer versus my computer. I have the Google Earth set up on my computer. If anyone wants to, I'll change this up once we wrap up here. People can move off if they want to move off, but if they want to zoom into any of these dots, if they happen to be right beside your house, you can see what the record is and see if you know the location a little bit, or if you want to go check it out. So all those pink pointers are records of plants that I think might be legitimate wild records of garden-related species. So with that, I'll wrap up the formal part of the talk. And if you want to do some diving into these dots, we can do that. So thank you very much, everyone. Is milk parsley quite toxic, like some others of that family? I didn't come across mention of it being, I didn't specifically search on that. The question was in my mind.
It's a very misleading name if it is.
Yeah, the milk part of it is because it has latex, milk sap, which generally is associated with toxic. But it's probably not deadly toxic like the water hemlock. Otherwise, that would have come up as I was just doing general searching on the species. So I don't know exactly its toxicity, but tasting it is not recommended as a means of identification.
Not in that family, certainly.
Yes, Peter.
We're picking on one of these possible observations.
Yeah.
What would you both prefer as part of our checkup? Would you be interested in voucher specimens, or
Yes, absolutely. A voucher specimen is great. We don't retain voucher specimens ourselves as an organization. We have herbarium cabinets that are full of specimens, but they're all intended to go off to permanent storage at Nova Scotia Museum, New Brunswick Museum, Acadia, when Acadia had a curator, and so on. So specimens are great. I know it's a bigger ask for people to be collecting pressing specimens, but if you're familiar with that and you're willing to do it, that's A1 the best.
Yes, sometimes I'm not sure whether a thing is. I've got all kinds of things keep popping up in my garden. I really don't know if they're wild or you were talking about garden escapes that have
Yes.
become naturalist. So at the moment, I've got mulleins popping up everywhere.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So why would that? Are they sort of naturalized or?
So the question was about mulleins, and mulleins in a garden. Are those a wild plant or those a not wild plant? If something is only occurring right inside a garden, I would have a higher threshold for calling it wild versus non-wild. The common mullein, most people don't ever plant common mullein deliberately, but the seeds certainly do get into gardens and can grow up. And a species like that, if it's known to be more or less a strictly non-deliberate cultivation plant, a garden record maybe is legitimate as a wild record, but there are a bunch of other mulleins that are ornamental garden plants, and those are more of a borderline case, where I would definitely not call one of the ornamental mulleins wild if it happened to show up 5 years after it was first cultivated in someone's garden. But ultimately, these are arbitrary decisions. It's not a particular absolute right or wrong answer in deciding how to describe these things. But those are some of the general rules principles that I'm using to decide should something be included on the list of wild plants in Nova Scotia. If it's only in that yard space, that cultivated, managed yard space, then I would tend to not treat it as wild, even if it's doing its own thing within that yard space. I'd probably restrict the wild to for garden plants to having spread beyond the yard out into an unmanaged habitat.
Well, normally I haven't seen them for years.
Yeah.
They've just suddenly popped up now this year.
Mulleins are one of the seeds that lasts a long, long time in the soil. There's a famous Michigan experiment that the scientists 100 years ago put a bunch of cylinders in the ground with seeds, and they're brought up every 5 or 10 years or something, and the mullein seeds are still germinating that I put in the ground 100 years ago.
Now, the other one I wanted to ask about was lupins.
Oh, yes.
Now, what's the story on those?
Lupins are a West Coast species. They're not an East Coast species, naturally. We don't have any native lupins. The native lupins that we do have are generally called Lupinus polyphyllus, but that is perhaps incorrect. I was corresponding with someone a few years back who said that she believed that much of our lupin was actually a hybrid of two West Coast species, the Nootkaensis and the polyphyllus lupins. Either way, they are wild and seriously established and not going anywhere, but they're not native.
Very widespread.
Yes, and people do love them and treat them as if they're native. Like it's a symbol of coastal Nova Scotia and coastal Prince Edward Island, the big patches of lupins.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I will see what I can do about sharing if anyone wants to delve into that map further. Coming into Halifax. I'm going to turn off all my background Google Earth stuff. Now we've got just the plant records of interest for the subject at hand. Bob, I didn't mention, I forgot to mention, as we went through, one of those pictures was yours. I don't know if you noticed.
I saw my,
Coreopsis.
thank you for the credit, yeah.
Yeah,
So that was actually quite an interesting thing there on the new highway there. Like there's a lot of it.
so yeah, they must have been seeded in, right? With or
I think, yeah, it must have been, but it's very like it isn't. It's clumpy, like it's in with some native stuff too. It's very odd.
So yeah, that's one that probably pretty close to qualifying already as a wild Nova Scotia plant, but knowing that it's present for a few more years would be a good confirmation of that. So I'm going to zoom into Halifax here further. And it definitely shows how much gardening there is around Halifax. I've always thought that Halifax was quite a spectacular city for gardens. If there's any of these dots that you want to delve into, just shout them out. Any of these spots that you recognize? These ones down here are something that there's enough records of the same thing that stop. Parthenocissus tricuspidata, that's the Boston ivy, the type of Virginia creeper that Ivy League is named after. And there's a whole bunch of records along the waterfront trail there in Dartmouth that seem to be growing just over rock fill and in places that don't look like they were all planted. So it may be established there. It's really widely planted on and around buildings elsewhere, which doesn't really count, but might be established there. That's an easy one to check out if you're in the Dartmouth waterfront area.
Is it too early to consider that one might be invasive, like the English ivy?
It's a plant that, by the looks of it on buildings, you'd think it has some invasive potential. It's not as aggressive necessarily on the forest understory as the hedera ivy, but yeah, not something I would choose to leave if it showed up in my woodlot at home. Some of the lakeside parks in Dartmouth have some interesting things. There's that Lonicera japonica Japanese honeysuckle record, which was that's Lake Bannock, and there's the details of the record, recorded in 2020, and it's listed in our database as 200 meters. It might actually be more precise than that on iNaturalist, but that's one there's not a whole bunch of records of that viney Japanese honeysuckle in Nova Scotia, but that one is, if we zoom right into what the landscape looks like. You never know until you're on the ground. It could be all manicured underneath that forest cover in there, and maybe it is deliberately planted, but it looks like that's a fairly natural forest cover there, and the plant isn't right beside the buildings if it's accurately located. So that's why I put it as a suspected wild plant. And I've looked at these photographs in iNaturalist individually, and if it's growing over top of a trellis or something, I'm going to throw that one out right away. But this one was not. Let's see what else we can find here. Oh yeah, these ones. What's the name of that lake? This is the pink turtle head. We have the white turtle head, a native species. It's fairly common. The pink turtle head is a more southern plant of the United States, but it's a widely used garden plant. And it does seem to be showing up on the lakeshore down there, probably established and wild. Whoops. Zoom out a bit. The spring heath, that pink flowered heath that you see in a lot of gardens right now, is called Erica carnea. Or there's also a bunch of different horticultural hybrids that involve that species and relatives that make it a bit more confusing. But the record was by a fellow named Nick Belleville, who did a lot of analysis. I don't think he's still around Nova Scotia, but this particular record seems to be away from gardens as well in the Shuby Park area. Another interesting one. Another one that I wanted to check out was this one here. There's two records of smooth sumac, which is it looks almost exactly like the staghorn sumac, the common big shrubby sumac that you see in yards and in the wild, but it doesn't have the fuzzy twigs. It's smooth, and I was surprised to see that. You don't see that in horticulture very much, as far as I know. And it's shown up in two different places in Halifax that seem to be not planted. It's on a municipal park in this case, and it's up on Chain of Lakes Trail in the other one. And is it established here? It could be, I guess, but another one to check out. Not a complicated identification to make. If the twigs are smooth and have a waxy covering, it's smooth sumac. If they're fuzzy, it's the staghorn sumac. Yes.
There's just an abbreviation I didn't recognize from the lawyer discussion there.
Okay. Oh yes, that was my possible Artemisia princeps. My short form with that one because I had a possible. Someone noticed a few years back there was a whole bunch. It wasn't just these two records here of the Moroccan toadflax or dwarf snapdragon. It was all along the Hammonds Plains Road in the gravel. Somehow there were a bunch of these quite pretty little snapdragon plants growing along there. If that was just a one-year thing, I probably wouldn't put it on the list, but if they're going back year after year, then it seems like they're established.
Does that predate the fire?
That's right where the fire was last.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it could be, I don't know, someone was feeling like they needed to add some seeds to get things less blackened, or maybe the fire stimulated something. It's hard to know. But the plants were not far from the road in this case. They were right in the gravel. I'll zoom out a bit, maybe for people who are tuning in from away, if there's anything else that up here in the North Mountain, that's one of the yellow foxglove records, Digitalis grandiflora. There's this one is one that was found by one of our staff members. So we already have some pretty good information about this one. This was by Colin Chapman, who used to work for us. It's a type of spring flowering mustard called basket of gold, Orinia saxatilis, a rock outcrop sort of plant. He noted that it was just present to a very small extent in a ditch within about 10 meters of a house. Maybe going back to visiting this site and seeing if it spread more extensively would help decide if we should include it. We decided at the time, yeah, that's not really established well enough to list for the province. We'll zoom up to Cape Breton. Oh, this one was right. This is we were mentioning mullins before. This is Verbascum phlomoides, an ornamental species of mullein. It's both ornamental and potentially weedy. So it was where the new Antigonish library was constructed. It seemed to be in some waste ground there, and it was not clearly in a garden, but it might have been introduced in association with gardening in some way. So that was one that I'm hoping someone would check out. These are some plants up at Marion Witten, I think is the person who has a lot of horticultural records in this general area, but noted specifically that these were escaped to the ditch and potentially spreading. That's the blue lobelia that I showed at one point in the talk, and this is a type of pea family, a yellow flowered pea shrubby pea family member, Christi fascicularis, I think is the scientific name. There's some native grasses that have been planted in the old tar pond site in Sydney. There's a bunch of different weird things that have been planted in there and are sort of wild, but not thoroughly wild yet. Sorghastrum nutans, this big, quite attractive grass, is one of them. A bunch of records in there. It's mostly Dave McCorkadale and students that have documented those. Dave, recently retired professor at Cape Breton University. So I can go on like this for a long time, but I'm imagining people might want to starting to think about going home. So I'll wrap it up there. You're welcome to come up and look at the map a little bit further.
Wondering if, like, people, I'm trying to think if there's some way to email a PDF of the map or something that people could maybe look at. I could follow up on that.
Yeah, I mean, I can send the Excel file for sure.
Yeah.
You can scan through. It lists the county and then it lists the general location of each record.
Okay.
And in the map, it would be hard to send the whole of Nova Scotia at a scale that was then readable. But anyone who's interested in Google Earth, we can send the Google Earth file around. It's quite an easy program.
I'll ask if anyone is interested.
Yeah, if you just install Google Earth on your computer,
Yeah.
simple download, and then open up the file like any other
Okay.
file opening, and it'll pop right up on your maps.
Okay.
So, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon.
No, you don't need to clap again.
That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna stop recording now.